Oh, yes. WWE has finally done it. They finally done it. They created their own documentary about WrestleMania 9, the controversial WrestleMania 9 that some fans talk about in regards to the pay-per-view being one of the worst, if not the worst, main event pay-per-view at a WrestleMania of all times. This is WrestleMania 9. It takes place in Las Vegas at Caesar's Palace in 1993. And there's always this whole lore around how the main event ended and the controversy surrounding how it ended and politics that came into play in regards to the whole entire main event. Now, I definitely suggest you guys go watch this documentary. It's streaming on Peacock, and you guys should go and check it out. But in this video, we're going to talk about WrestleMania 9, and we're going to talk about all the things that these guys addressed in this whole documentary. And we're going to talk about whether politics played a part in this whole entire event or whether it was just business. Was it politics or was it business? Let's talk about it.
Yeah. Wrestling in the ring, thoughts that always bring. Talking all about the moves in our grooves. Wrestling talks and thoughts we never forgot. Slamming down the truth in our booth. Conversations in the air with flair and care. Legends of the past, memories that last. Wrestling talks and thoughts, connecting the dots. From high flyer to submissions, we make our missions. From Raw to SmackDown, we wear the crown. NXT to AEW, we bring the view. Wrestling talks and thoughts in our slots. Fans united, always excited. Wrestling talks and thoughts in our spots.
Here we are, WrestleMania 9, the controversial WrestleMania 9 that has this ending that fans just completely hated because they felt like another performer was definitely slided out of being seen as a top guy and deserved to get the nod and the push. But let's talk about this documentary and how they address why it was booked the way it was. Now, if you guys have not seen this documentary, it is streaming on Peacock. I suggest you guys go and check it out, and it lays out all the facts and everything in regards to this whole entire pay-per-view. I'm going to spare you guys the details. I'm not going to go through the whole match cards and talk about all the other matches. I'm going to get straight to the meat and potatoes, and I'm not going to waste your time. And I don't like wasting my time, and I'm quite sure you don't like your time being wasted. I'm not going to talk about the animals that were involved and the vulture that was standing across from the Undertaker and Undertaker being concerned about this bird going crazy. I ain't going to talk about none of that crap. I'm not going to talk about none of that. I'm going to get to the two things that everybody are concerned about in regards to this whole entire pay-per-view, and that is Hulk's black eye and the last match at the end in regards to a lot of fans believing that Hogan politicked his way into the main event in order to become world heavyweight champion. Bret Hart, being seen as the guy who is the leader of the new generation, had a lot of issues in regards to how this whole entire event was booked. And he agreed a lot with the fans, saying that it was complete rubbish and that it should not have been booked to have Hogan be challenged by Yokozuna for the World Heavyweight Championship and then beat him and then take the title, because it made Bret look weak or like he was incapable of defeating the challenger, which was Yokozuna at the time. And some fans felt like, Bret should have got the nod in beating Yokozuna at this main event. But in this whole documentary, they talk about how Vince was faced with a booking decision in regards to bringing back Hogan, who he had subsequently pushed out of the company and felt like Hogan was past his prime and felt like Hulkamania had ran its course and he wanted to move on to a new class of performers to now push the company forward. And the main guy who would lead that charge would be Bret Hart. Bret Hart would go on record and say that he felt betrayed, he felt backstabbed by Vince because Vince was the guy who told him face to face as the man of the company, saying that he would be the man that's going to lead the charge and he was going to be a champion for a long time, but ultimately decides to call back in his big draw, which was Hulk Hogan, to come and try to save the event so that he can boost sales, merchandise, and ticket buy rates in order to make the event a success. But it wasn't just because Vince just wanted to call Hogan back in. You would see from the booking promoters, from the people that were involved, that they thought Hogan would be involved in this whole WrestleMania main event. A lot of you guys who know the history of WrestleMania know that Hogan was the catalyst and the guy that WrestleMania was built on. He carried WrestleMania on his back. WrestleMania started with Hogan being the top star and the guy who would be booked to fight in the main events and who a lot of people would come to see. And he was the selling point for WrestleMania. Come see WrestleMania and come buy into the larger-than-life persona, Hulk Hogan. Now, when they were booking this event, the investors and the producers that were involved in hosting this event at Caesar's Palace assumed that Hogan would be a part of WrestleMania because they thought WrestleMania, they thought the biggest attraction, Hulk Hogan, would be a total package involved in this whole event. But when they heard that there will be no Hogan, they were saying to themselves, no Hogan? A WrestleMania? No Hogan? And to them, it kind of didn't make any sense. So Vince McMahon was faced with that pressure of bringing back Hogan, who he had, again, as I said before, pushed out of the company. They covered that in the documentary that Hogan was actually pushed out of the company because Vince wanted to move forward. And you can see in this one-on-one interview with Vince McMahon, as he's having this whole sit-down interview with Hogan about him leaving and going on to do other things, and asking him, does he feel like Hogan's time is up? Has he run his course? And Hogan is like shaking his head slightly no, and then he's responding in the way that Vince McMahon wants him to respond in the interview. But Hogan never felt like his time was up. He felt like he was being pushed out by Vince, so he only responded to what Vince wanted and complied to his request, and Hogan left and went on to do other things. But Hogan indeed was not past his prime, and we would see that later on in WCW as he would turn heel and form the NWO and have later success. But now, in regards to this current situation with WrestleMania 9, Vince McMahon was faced with bringing Hogan back in to boost sales and buy rates for this whole entire event, because his new up-and-coming star, which is Bret Hart and Yokozuna, who was supposed to be carrying the main event, the promoters themselves and even some of the fans themselves kind of had some level of doubt of whether they really wanted to buy into the pay-per-view or not. So now we have the business aspect that comes into play. A lot of fans assumed it was politics, that Hogan schmoozed his way into the arms of Vince McMahon and said, listen, brother, I want you to put me in the main event, see? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to save the day after Bret Hart gets his ass handed to him by Yokozuna. And then I'm going to carry on the World Heavyweight Championship and everybody's going to go wild for Hulkamania. But that's not what actually happened. What happened was Vince McMahon was faced with business pressure because, as they explained in the documentary, the first week of sales, they started to hit a decline and tickets were not selling as much as they thought it would sell. And then once Hogan was booked and placed on the card, ticket sales went back up. They were able to sell out the whole entire venue and they were able to make the money that they were able to make. But not only that, but the investors, or the people who were hosting the event, wanted Hogan. Hogan was requested. Hogan was desired. Even at the end of the pay-per-view, you can see that when they went around to the crowd and they began to ask the crowd what was the best part of this event, they said Hogan coming to win the World Heavyweight Championship. No mention of Bret Hart or Yokozuna or anybody else on the card. Primarily Hogan being champion. And that's what I want to talk about. The whole business aspect of a person being a main event draw, and the reason why they are a main event draw and why they are needed. Why we need a John Cena, why we need a Roman Reigns, why we needed a Hulk Hogan, why we needed a Bruno Sammartino, a Bob Backlund, why we needed The Rock, why we needed a Triple H, a Stone Cold Steve Austin. These big names are the names that put butts in seats. And in this whole documentary, you get to see the business aspect. No mention of politics were actually mentioned in regards to Hogan having some level of influence as to why the main event was changed. Bret Hart would go on the record to vent his feelings and say that he felt betrayed by Vince McMahon because Vince told him that he was seen as the main event star, and he felt betrayed by Hogan because they had a whole conversation in regards to the event, and then later on Vince and Hogan would approach him with the idea of having Hogan take the belt from Yokozuna after Bret would lose the belt, and Bret would feel so disappointed because he's saying to himself like, hey, you just told me I'm going to be the main event guy who's going to carry this belt and hold this belt for a very long time, and now you're going to have me lose this title to Yokozuna just to only give it back to a former star who was supposedly pushed out of the company. Now, I can understand Bret's complete frustration and how the new generation was advertised for that whole year and how Bret was considered, and Bret is considered the leader of the new generation. But however, in order for the new generation to be pushed in a monumental way or to be considered believable, you need to have the passing of the torch, or you need to have some level of assistance from the older generation that's been carrying it for so long to give the newer generation that level of validation. So if anybody goes and they watch this documentary, you have to leave understanding nothing but the facts. If you don't, you got to be either deaf, blind, or dumb. Deaf because you obviously didn't hear what was going on. Blind because you apparently didn't see what was going on. And completely dumb, hearing and seeing what was going on and not accepting the complete facts that Hogan had nothing to do with the politics. It was nothing but just straight business, all about business. And the truth of the matter is that when it comes to Bret Hart being the main guy or the household name that he was trying to work himself into being, it took a very long time for Bret to be that. And not only that, but I actually did a video a while back called The 10 Greatest World Champions of All Times. And I did a brief cover on Bret having low ratings as a champion and why the belt was passed on to Shawn, or Shawn was considered to be someone in the running up of being a world champion. How Vince wanted to try out Shawn Michaels because Bret, as world champion, was not boosting ratings and he was not increasing ratings. As a matter of fact, once Bret was champion, around the time Bret was champion, ratings was on a deep decline. And Vince McMahon brought back Hulk Hogan to try to bring back up those ratings or the increase of business. But even at that moment, when he did bring back Hogan, he did see an increase, a slight increase, but again, wrestling was still at a decline. Now, Bret Hart is one of my favorite wrestlers of all times. He's in my top 5 favorite wrestlers of all times. And the sad truth and the fact is that Bret Hart was not boosting ticket sales, and him being world champion at the time, wrestling was at a decline. Now, was wrestling at a decline because of fans slowly moving away from the product? Yes. And not only that, but they were not getting anything fresh and anything new, and they needed something different. And Bret would be the form of that something different and something fresh and new, as well as Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, and all the other performers. But the sad truth was that Bret Hart being that new guy, there wasn't no increase in ratings. As a matter of fact, ratings would sorely dip. And Vince McMahon would see an increase in ratings once he put the belt on Shawn Michaels. As I said prior before, Hulk Hogan was pushed out by Vince McMahon because Vince McMahon wanted to use someone else to be the catalyst to lead the next generation of performers. And then Bret Hart would be pushed out by Vince McMahon as he wanted to use Shawn Michaels to be the new catalyst to lead the next generation of performers. And funny enough, Bret Hart would be placed in the same exact situation that Hulk Hogan was placed in years prior. So when we look at the situation for what it is, was it based on politics, or was it based on just business? Now, it's so annoying that everybody throws this word politics around and just feels like because a person has top influence based upon their main event draw that they can just go to the main guy and say, listen, if you don't give me this spot or you don't give me what I want, I'm walking out on the company. And that's not what happened, because as you guys have seen, or if you guys don't know, in the destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, where they talked about how Ultimate Warrior tried to use his pull and his influence as being the top guy, as in to get money out of Vince or try to hold Vince up for $500,000, how Vince gave him his $500,000, but he also ended his contract and terminated the Ultimate Warrior. So we know that Vince McMahon was not subjugated to brute force influence by his own talent. Vince McMahon was not so easily swayed by his talent. Vince McMahon was more swayed by business, and that's what they show in this documentary. A lot of you guys know about the situation with Jeff Jarrett, how Jeff Jarrett tried to hold Vince McMahon up for $500,000 as well. He did the same exact thing, told Vince McMahon at a pay-per-view event that he would not drop the Intercontinental title to anybody until he gets that $500,000. And Vince McMahon said, okay, I'll give you a $500,000 bonus. Once he gave him the $500,000 bonus, he said, you're going to drop the title tonight. He drops the title. And as soon as Jeff Jarrett walked backstage, he was cut. And that's why I think the lines were blurred with Bret Hart, because Bret Hart kind of felt like that position he had was very coveted for himself, and that's something that he himself owned and he possessed. It's like, hey, bro, you're not boosting pay-per-view buy rates, selling tickets, or putting viewerships on the screen. But this guy is, and this guy is who we need to move on to. And that's what it was about. It was about business. That's not to say that we didn't want to see Bret with the championship. So this documentary in itself definitely spells everything out and makes it pretty clear for us exactly how this match was booked and what was the whole defining factor as to why it was booked the way it was booked. But the truth of the matter is that this actually happened again. And fans kind of complain like, you know, who would book such a pay-per-view like that? Like, what kind of pay-per-view would you book where you have the main guy go into a pay-per-view, win a championship or lose a championship, and then right after someone wins the championship, they get booked into another match to fight another match right after they just won the championship or lost the championship? Like how can you book something like that? Like, you know, that's a terrible way to book a pay-per-view. And what's ridiculous is that it actually happened again. Vince McMahon does it again. He did it at Elimination Chamber 2010 when John Cena beat Triple H, as they were the last two competitors in the Elimination Chamber match. John Cena would make Triple H tap out. Vince McMahon would come out and announce that John Cena, don't leave the ring. You have another match that you need to take on, and that's defending your belt against Batista. Batista comes down the ramp. He fights John Cena, beats him for the belt after John Cena just went through an Elimination Chamber match that lasted probably like 45 minutes. This guy is completely drained and has to fight another match to a fresh as a daisy opponent, lose the match, and Batista will win the World Heavyweight Championship, only holding on to the belt for about a month and then dropping it to John Cena at WrestleMania. But again, like I said, it happened again. Let's take No Mercy 2007, where Randy Orton was awarded the World Heavyweight Championship, and then Triple H challenged him for the title. Randy Orton was like, hey, I'm not going to have a match against you. I was just awarded the title. But Vince McMahon said, that's a great idea. Why? Because they're at a pay-per-view, and what kind of pay-per-view would it be if we didn't have a World Heavyweight Championship match? Because we didn't have one on the card because John Cena had been injured. He had to relinquish the title. Vince McMahon had to find someone else to hold on to the title. Instead of doing a tournament, he awarded the title to Randy Orton. Randy Orton would be challenged by Triple H. Vince McMahon said, all right, let's have that match and let's book that match, and we'll have that match right now. Triple H would beat Randy Orton for the title, but then Umaga would challenge Triple H for the title. Triple H would beat Umaga, and then Randy Orton that same exact night would invoke his rematch clause for the title. He would beat Triple H in a last man standing match. And again, it happened in one whole pay-per-view where match upon match upon match was being booked for the World Heavyweight Championship. And I understand it. It was based upon creativity, not poor booking decisions, but creativity around the World Heavyweight Championship. I mean, come on. Every time we have a World Heavyweight Championship match, there's a competitor, there's the champion. They fight, and then there's one victor. There's the competitor, there's the champion. They fight, and then there's one victor. Every match can't be that way. That's why we have triple threat matches. That's why we have fatal four-way matches. That's why we have ladder matches, hardcore matches. They try to mix it up. Give us something creative around the World Heavyweight Championship. And I like that. I like the fact that they try to spice it up and give us something new. And that's the reason why we have these things like these sudden bookings at the end where the card is subject to change. But I'll give you another example. Let's take July 25th, 2011, where CM Punk would walk out on the company a few weeks prior, and they needed to crown a new WWE champion because they didn't know whether CM Punk was going to renew his contract with WWE or not. So they do together a little tournament. Rey Mysterio will come out as the victor of this tournament and win the World Heavyweight Championship against The Miz in the finals of this whole entire tournament. But what happens? John Cena challenges Rey Mysterio to a world title match. John Cena wasn't even involved in his daggone tournament. Like, he just comes out of nowhere and he challenges Rey Mysterio for the World Heavyweight Championship. And I think it wasn't even promoted that John Cena challenged Rey Mysterio. I think it was promoted that John Cena would be challenging Rey Mysterio for the world title. Anyway, we all know what happens. Even if you didn't know what happened, you can guess what happened. He fights against John Cena. John Cena wins the world title, and this was all a ploy to book John Cena versus CM Punk for the following pay-per-view to have an undisputed WWE Championship match. And this is exactly how it goes. Like, everything was just like booked on top of each other. So again, I think that these kind of matches are booked for creative purposes, and things like this have never been done. And I know, I get it. Hogan gets a lot of heat for being a liar and telling some of the truths, or embellishing some stories, and you have to fact check what Hogan says. But everything that Hogan says is not a lie, and everything that Hogan puts out there in regards to what happened, sometimes we have to take in consideration that maybe Hogan is not the only person that could be lying about a story. That sometimes when some of these people tell their story, that they could be embellishing or lying. I give you an example. Hogan's black eye. At that WrestleMania, Hogan suffered a black eye, and Macho Man Randy Savage will go on to be salacious about how Hulk Hogan received this black eye, even going to antagonize that he had something to do with Hogan getting that cookie around his eye. He would be at commentary saying, "Oh, Hogan, you know how you got that eye. You know who did it to you. Oh, yeah." Like, he would go on record to do all that, and people would believe him. Even Macho Man would tell Scott Steiner, and in the documentary, Scott Steiner would say that he believed Macho Man's story. When Jimmy Hart and Brutus the Barber Beefcake actually confirmed the story that Hogan told, which was that a jet ski popped him in the eye while he was jet skiing on the beach, and that's how he received the black eye. And they both were there carrying him to the hospital because he had to get stitches in his eye. Now, why would they sit there and lie about Hogan getting a black eye or him getting his behind whipped by Macho Man Randy Savage? Like, it makes no sense. It's completely stupid. But again, this goes to my point that some of the facts that we think, or some of the truths that we think are truths, need to be confirmed when we do some research in regards to what actually happened. Because sometimes as fans, we have our feelings and then there's facts. And our feelings always goes and coincides with what we see on TV. And sometimes, or the truth of the matter is, most of the time what we see on TV when it comes to wrestling is storyline. But sometimes it's them breaking the fourth wall and them actually going off script and really telling us what's really going on behind the screen when they dropping pipe bombs like CM Punk, right? When we deal with business in WWE, we can't always call everything politics. And sometimes politics do influence business, and sometimes business do influence politics. But we do know that at the end of the day, business will always win over politics because they're going to want that money. They want that cash, period. So when we look at everything holistically, you got to ask yourself, is it politics or is it business? All right, guys, thank you for joining me in this video. Join me again as I do one of my weekly uploads. And speaking of poor booking decisions, I did a video about 7 characters Vince McMahon ruined that dealt with Vince McMahon's poor booking decisions. You guys can go check it out on the channel. Join us as we go live weekly and as I drop weekly uploads. Again, I am signing out, and I will be back at you guys again with another video, another weekly upload talking about all things wrestling, mostly WWE. I'll see you guys later. Peace.